So Catherine, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Douglas, and Happy New Year, everybody. I honestly cannot believe we are already into February of 2022. It has been a busy month or so. This is always a popular time for career coaching. It's a new year and people are thinking about what they want to do from a personal and professional standpoint. And one of the questions that we often get around this time is around resumes. And so we decided, we did a webinar last year, but things are constantly changing. So we wanted to provide this update for you all. Some of you may have looked at the worksheet and listened to the recording that we sent out last month. If so, that's great. You may have some specific follow-up questions. If you have not, no worries, it's totally fine. We're trying to go through and proactively address questions that I tend to get. But as Douglas said, if you have follow-up questions along the way, feel free to chat them in and she'll moderate those. So let's dive in. One thing that people are starting to become a lot more aware of these days is applicant tracking systems. And the abbreviation is ATS. You've probably seen this if you've been updating your resume and doing some research. These are basically online systems, software systems used by 99% of Fortune 500 companies and a growing number of small to mid-sized businesses to filter resumes before a recruiter or a hiring manager even sees them. So companies are getting hundreds of applications, people are overwhelmed, and these systems, in theory, will filter through the resumes of people who have applied, scan for keywords within the job description, and then rank them according to what they deem as the best match. So obviously, the more keywords you have in your resume that match what the ATS is searching for, the more likely it is that you're going to be selected for review. Obviously, how do I figure out what those keywords are? That's a question that I often get. So first, we need to start by looking at that job description in detail. What are the words that repeat? And pay particular attention to the required and preferred qualifications. These are certainly going to be keywords that ATS is looking for. And we want to put those throughout our resume. Some of these will be soft skills like collaboration, communication, leadership, which of course, everybody is going to say that they have. So our goal is to back those up later on in the resume. And then also hard skills. So, experience with SAP or, project management or Salesforce. These are some of it's a combination of soft skills and hard skills. One thing that we can't control is that one of the keywords, unfortunately, tends to be job titles. So let's say you do a ton of project management in your job. We all do, but you don't have a project management title. Unfortunately, if you are applying online, that may be something that knocks you out of consideration by the ATS. And that is why, I and many other job coaches are going to talk about the importance of building relationships within organizations that you're interested in so that you can generate those referrals, which can, push you past this ATS system if you otherwise might not have come up. A tool that people do find helpful is Jobscan, and that's an online platform that helps you identify the keywords so that you can include them in your resume. But ultimately, these things can be clunky, right? It's technology, and technology doesn't always work. Many of these systems are outdated, and as such, they don't do well with the modern templates. A recent study showed that up to 75% of resumes are never actually seen by a human. They're getting scanned out, even if someone is qualified. So again, we want to do our best to beat the system, but ultimately also want to make sure we're incorporating proactive outreach and relationship building into our job search. So let's say you make it through the ATS scan. Now studies show that people reading this resume for the first time scan it for all of 6 seconds. And so what that means is that top section of your resume is prime real estate, right? We want to make sure that this top section really sets the stage and shows your value add. It's also a great way to tailor to a specific job and put their keywords in. This summary, 2 to 3 sentences, I wouldn't, my general rule of thumb is if it's not something that really speaks to your value and is well written, I would not include it. A way to get around that is select accomplishments or career highlights right up at the top. 3 or 4 bullets that really back up what you're saying and align with the job description. This is also a great option for people who are maybe making a transition, maybe going back to a role that they had previously. So their most recent experience isn't necessarily the most relevant. This is a great way to pull that up so that when we're scanning, the first thing I see, excuse me, is your most relevant experience, some strong results, and you want to get my attention before I scan down and see that maybe you're not currently in marketing, but you were 5 years ago. It's a way to pull up the most relevant information. And again, somebody submitted a question about how to kind of write an engaging summary section. The best thing you can do is, again, look at that job description, look at those preferred and required qualifications, and include them up front so that you really grab the reader's attention. Douglas, I see we've got something in the chat. Do we have any questions or at this point?
Not right now. That was me dropping in our landing page for our participants. But as I look at this professional summary and select accomplishments, I was kind of thinking about, and you might be answering this later, but for your select accomplishments, is this pulling out your experiences without regard to the timeline of your jobs? It's sort of a combination of all of your experiences here, and you're really putting the salient pieces first. Is that what's going on?
Yes, that's exactly what's going on. Thanks for clarifying. Yes, we are pulling the most relevant experience and accomplishments up. And so when we do this, a question I often get is, now, do I repeat that bullet, further down in the exact section? The answer is no, right? We're pulling up things, but we're not repeating them later in the document. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions as we go, but I will move on to quantifying bullets. And don't worry, I'm going to go straight into what to do when you can't quantify? Because that's also a question that we get very often. But most of you have heard about the importance of quantifying bullets on your resume. If you did look at the worksheet that we sent out in the last email, I actually gave you a kind of a format to build these out, where we kind of build out those STAR stories. You've probably heard that term before too. So situation, task, action, and result. And so in that worksheet, you actually have the opportunity to write these out. This is a situation. This is what I was tasked to do. This is what I did, and this was the result. Now, in a resume, we focus on the action and the result. But the act of going through that entire STAR story is very helpful, because ultimately, when you get to the interview process, you have the opportunity to talk about the context around it. But from a resume standpoint, we're keeping things short and sweet and to the point. Here are two examples where we can obviously put numbers around accomplishments, like securing 100% retention rate for 6 consecutive quarters. This is an alum who's in customer success, not project management, customer success. And we were looking at a job description, and retention was a key point. And customer centric was also a word that was coming up throughout the job description. So we wove that in by saying, leveraging a customer centric approach to nurture and expand relationships. So in this case, we listed the result first. Oftentimes with a strong number like that, 100% retention, it's good to lead with it. But as another example, in the next bullet, executed an $8 million repositioning of this large building, driving a 19% rental increase and bottom line growth. So in this case, we led with the action and ended with the result. Either option is totally fine, but we want to make sure that we're clear about what you did and how that added value.
Awesome. We had a question in the chat related to bullets and the resume in general, which is, should the verbs be in past or present tense, or an alternative tense?
That is a great question. So typical rule of thumb, if you are currently doing it, it can be in present tense. So I lead a team of 10 people. I am creating this resource, right? Because it's not done. Now, if it's done, you have executed this $8 million repositioning, it should be in past tense. So it's okay to have both in your current role. But as you go to previous roles, that should all be past tense, obviously. So in terms of bullets that can't be quantified, we can't always include numbers. And in those cases, my suggestion is always to think about the goal. So what were we hoping to achieve? Did we want to streamline efforts? Did we want to increase collaboration? Do we want to create a cohesive message? These are all valuable contributions. They just don't have a number associated with it. So, for example, let's say you have led the launch of a new project management software, but you don't have any stats yet to quantify the impact. So in this case, we implemented a project management platform that streamlined workflows and enhanced communication across multiple teams, right? So this is what we are expecting it to do. Now you could, we could say expected to, increase efficiency by 15%. Even if you don't know that's what you are expecting, that's totally fine. But you don't have to have a number. Not everything has to have a number associated with it. This is another example. So gain buy-in from sales teams to adopt SAP, leading the migration of 3 internal systems to one platform, increasing efficiencies and driving growth within new and existing accounts. So again, we're quantifying where we can. It's 3 systems to 1. But the key point here is that it's that gaining that buy-in in order to lead this change. This is change management. We can't always put a number around that, especially early on in a process. One page or two, this is also a very popular question. For senior level positions requiring 10 plus years of experience or more, 2 pages is acceptable. And oftentimes, especially from a recruiter standpoint, 2 pages may be preferred. You want to show that experience and that seniority. In that case, especially if there are things that you really want somebody to see, or results that you want to highlight, or exposure that you want to highlight that maybe is on page 2, that's a great thing to pull up into that, career highlights section, select accomplishments, whatever you want to call that. But again, if it's 2 pages, the initial scan is still 6 seconds. They're looking for job titles, they're looking for results, they're looking for education. Then they will hopefully go back and read the whole thing. But starting out, we still want to make sure on a 2-page that the first page makes them want to read the second page. If it's an entry-level position, I would always recommend a page. And the general rule is 1 page for every 10 years. But ultimately, our goal is to showcase the right amount of experience for that particular role. So if they're saying we want 5 years of experience, having 2 pages may give the impression that you are overqualified or will not be happy staying in that role. Rightly or wrongly, these are the assumptions that people have when they're scanning these things first go round. I will say, the 1 to 2 page general rule of thumb is still the same, but things have shifted a bit with the growth of technology. And, for startups and some tech companies, they may prefer a 1-page resume. Part of that is because they typically recruit a younger demographic. So, ageism does exist, unfortunately. So if we're going for, an environment that may be skewed younger, getting it down to a page and showing that you've really thought about the things that you've done that are most relevant to that company can be a good way to go. That might also be a good option if you are perhaps making a transition where you understand you may need to take a step back, to get into this new industry or function with the goal of moving up. Sometimes, and again, it depends on that particular role and how it's being described and what they're saying they want. In many cases, that would mean cutting that resume back down. And in general, I would say do not go over 2 pages unless they're asking for a CV, if it's an academic environment. Otherwise, we really do want to keep it to 2 pages.
Awesome. Catherine, we have a few more questions in the chat.
Yeah, great.
On that 6-second scan slide a few minutes ago, there was some text that was bolded. Was that for the purpose of this presentation, or is putting things in bold on the resume encouraged?
Yeah, so I am perfectly fine. I can go back to that. So yes, on the select accomplishments, I have bolded certain things. I think this is a great question because we got somebody emailed asking about how do you make your resume stand out when you have to use a simpler template for these online systems? So bolding, key results is one way to do that. I am totally fine with a pop of color. There's definitely ways to kind of weave in some creativity, but ultimately still stay with this format where things are where people want them to be.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
An unrelated question in the chat is about cover letters. Are they
Mhm.
still required? How much time do recruiters spend on the cover letter?
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Oh, cover letters. That's always a question. Yes, I think they are, if they say optional, we still want to do it. The studies, like people have done research on how often they're read and all that stuff. Ultimately, I think the last article I was reading said 67% of hiring managers will, at a minimum, scan the cover letter, if not read it fully. We don't know who the 33% are that don't. I would say at a minimum, they will look to see if you did it. And so I know that it definitely takes additional time and effort, but it is something we need to do. And there are a couple of samples on the GAA website, and I'll show you where those are linked at the end.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
So 2 more questions in the
Okay.
chat. Karen says she really likes the resume worksheet. She's curious if there's a template you suggest. So I'm going to drop into the chat the template you do suggest. It's a Google Drive link, so if anyone has any trouble, please let me know. And while folks are pulling that up and maybe have follow-up questions, we had a different question from Brooklyn to ask that she's seen some resume templates that include a small headshot of the applicant. Is that encouraged?
I honestly, I know they've gotten really popular. Personally, and from an HR standpoint, I would tend to discourage that because it could be seen as a form of bias in the hiring process. So part of what people are doing with these applicant tracking systems as well is trying to take some of the bias out. When I was in recruiting at Duke, we never shared photos because, again, bias exists, unfortunately, towards women, towards minorities, and it's not a required part of the process. So I tend to shy away from those templates.
Well, thank you. Again, as folks are looking over the template, we might have some follow-up questions, but I think you had some other things to go through.
I have, just one more slide to go through. I know we're trying to get these down to 30 minutes, make it more digestible, and give you all the chance to ask questions, but then obviously we hope you'll follow up with a coaching session. But gaps are something I get asked about a lot. How do you address that? Do you address that? Are people ever going to hire me again if I've taken a year or 3 off, or 5 or 10 years? And I will say that over the past, 10, 15 years, this has changed very dramatically as a result of first the financial crisis and now COVID. That being said, there is still a bias out there. A 2019 survey that I was looking at showed that interview chances did decrease for applicants who had gaps of 3 or more years. Now with COVID and the impact that it's had on working parents, and now, the great resignation that we're seeing, I hope the next survey, if they do it in 22 or 23, will show a shift in that. I think if you do have a gap, highlighting any recent training or certifications that you've done is good. People like to see continuing education. Maybe you're doing some volunteer work, or I know a lot of women that have, kind of do consulting on the side and isn't necessarily a full-blown business, but it's keeping their skills up. I would add that, definitely add that in. It addresses the gap, shows that you've been keeping your skills up. And maybe let's say you've been out of the paid workforce for more than 3 years, at that point, you certainly can, quickly address it on the resume in terms of, the timeline and the reason. But I would be, I would not try to over-explain it. I think that's the word I'm looking for. This is something that, especially women will do on the resume, and then in an interview or in a cover letter. All we need to know is that you took these last 5 years to be a full-time caregiver to your aging parents, or a stay-at-home parent and volunteer in the school system. From a resume standpoint, that's all I need. And from an interview standpoint, it's really, this is what I've been doing. I'm ready to get back into the full-time workforce.
Awesome, thanks. A little bit of a follow-up question. Would you include volunteer work at church, a board secretary experience? And if so, how would you include that and why?
Yeah, so I think if it is showing a skill set that is valuable to the work that you want to do, then certainly. I think a lot of people are involved with their church and doing very important work, whether that's member engagement or serving on a finance committee. If that is where you've been spending the majority of your time, then yes, I would include that. And there's a couple ways to do that. So the career article that I have here, the 10 rules to resume writing, there are a couple, actually four, four sample resumes linked there. One is a skills-based, which is a way to kind of lead with relevant skill sets and examples of you demonstrating those, and then listing your work experience and volunteer experience. The other way is to use the career highlights or select accomplishments format that I pulled up, and that is in the Google Doc that Douglas sent out. So we pull up the most relevant experiences. And then when you get into company names and job titles and that type of thing, you may have a professional experience and a volunteer experience section. But that would be a great thing if you're struggling with that. It's a great way to use your coaching session to dig into that.
Awesome, thanks. We had another question about, is there anything we can do to check if our resume will be readable by the ATS software? Was that what you mentioned with Jobscan earlier, or was that something different?
No, so Jobscan was actually a website that helps, it scans job descriptions and helps you, compares it to your resume and tells you what keywords you have and what might be missing. So that's a great resource. I mean, with the ATS, because there's so many companies using so many different versions and some are brand new and some are old, I don't know that there's ever a way to be 100% sure that you're going to make it through, which is, again, I always say we can do everything right and we can have a simple template and we can include every single keyword, and there is still a chance that it will not go through. Just because technology doesn't always work. So again, I would really focus on, the resume is important. People have been talking about the resume is going to die, like for years. It's not. It's still a part of the process. It needs to be pulled together. It needs to show your value add. But ultimately, it needs to be paired with proactive outreach, relationship building within companies of interest, that type of thing.
Awesome, thanks. Jonathan volunteered from the chat that he has been using a website called Vmock.com for an automated perspective and really liked it.
Oh, good.
So thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. And Sonia had asked about getting a copy of the slides. So once this presentation is over, I'm happy to send out a link to the slides, the recording, and I'll include that recommendation from Jonathan as well.
Yeah, and these are just a couple of the resume related resources that we have on the GAA site. I would encourage you to check out the resources section, the career resources section. We've got webinars, we've got articles, we've got email tips, we've got samples in terms of resumes, cover letters, outreach emails, all the things. So definitely check that out. And if you want to schedule a session to really delve into your own resume, then you just email alumnicareers@unc.edu and they will connect us. And I know we're at 1 o'clock, but I'm happy to stay on if people have more questions.
Well, cheers. Thank you. We do have one more question about LinkedIn. Can you comment on the importance of LinkedIn, the best practices, etc.?
Yes. So LinkedIn is probably, if you're going to be on any social networking site from a professional standpoint, I would be on LinkedIn. And we have a couple webinars. I think one we did last year. We'll probably update that at some point this year, just because things change on that site very often. But in terms of best practices, is very similar to the resume in terms of keywords. And if you want to be visible to recruiters who may be looking to fill positions, and I think, what is it, 97% of recruiters are on LinkedIn, then you need to make sure that the keywords are repeating throughout your profile. So the headline, which is automatically your job title, you can change that if your job title is not what you want it to be. The About You section should have the keywords. Your experience section should include those keywords, the skills, etc. And the more complete your profile is, the higher up you come in a search. So I would always say, at a minimum, have your photo. I think it's 15 times more likely to get viewed if you have a photo. Have a photo. Professional photo doesn't have to be a headshot, but not you in a tux or, out at a concert, like just a picture of you. Have the picture and have all those sections completed, because that will boost your rankings when people search.
Awesome, thank you. Mary just shared in the chat that she had a first round interview, which was an AI interview. And she learned that ATS awareness is important during those types of interviews.
Yeah, that is definitely something that is becoming more and more popular. It's a frustrating part of the job search these days, as it's becoming more and more impersonal by the day. And these keywords and phrases are going to, pop up in different parts of the process.
couple of follow-up questions from the chat about that.
Yeah.
Can you share more about the AI interview, the artificial intelligence interview? Sort of how does that work? What's that scenario look like? And maybe Mary, if you want to share more in the chat or come up on mute, that would be
Yeah.
awesome.
I mean, that's also something that probably would require a whole nother webinar.
Yeah, yes, but I practiced on a couple of other people on about that because they were going into first. So I don't mind speaking up on it because it's so fresh. It literally just happened last week. And the good news is I passed the robot test. As I said, I made it to a second.
Yay!
So that was yesterday. So we'll see if I make it to the third. But anyway, the AI interview, the artificial intelligence, I would argue is, in a simple way, is you're interviewing yourself and you're recording your answers to submitted questions. So it's the organization I interviewed for provided 4 questions. They are time limited. 3, 3, 2, 2 was my time limits on the 4. And you get 3, the software that was used, or the AI software or platform, was Higher View, VUE. And you have 3 attempts. So I honestly can tell you the truth on all 4 questions. The first one, I recorded myself. I hated all 4. I recorded 3 times on the first 2 questions. And actually the first 3, and then the fourth one, the second one, I got it right, so to speak. But you get 3 attempts to get it right. The good news is, I don't know if this is true for all the platforms, is that because I knew the question, I had written it down also, but it was also stayed on the screen between practice attempts, that I wrote an answer out. Sorry, everything's ringing, of course, at the same time. I wrote down what I wanted as an answer and practiced, and then re-recorded it. So my third was, in theory, the best, and then submitted those. So, but if your third is not your best, you're stuck with whatever it is, and then you must submit it because you can't go beyond 3. So basically, it was an interview of yourself, recording yourself. So practice on Google Meets or Zoom, like record and practice and practice and practice. You clearly don't know what the questions are in far advance, so you can't like practice the day before. I don't think there was an actual time limit within the time I start my interview, but there was a 72-hour limit from the time HR sent it to me getting it done. So I got it done between 48 hours and 72, somewhere in there. I did it. So that's my story.
That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
That's definitely, it sounds like the fact that they didn't give you a time limit in terms of like taking and retaking, that's a big plus, because it's definitely nerve-wracking when there's a timestamp attached to it. But I love this idea of, writing it down. And did it have the, because oftentimes they'll also have the timer so you can see like, oh, I'm at 1:30. Did it show you that too?
Yeah, and actually that's a good point. Sorry, that's another great tip. That was my other self-tip, let's say. On the first one, I practiced to see how long my answer was. And clearly in the beginning, it was like a 1:30 out of 3. I'm like, whoa, no. It's got to be a little longer. I got to use a little more, substance. I got to make it closer to 3. If they're giving me 3, I better take the 3. And without being wordy, but obviously, highlighting what I can highlight. So yeah, practicing. And yes, the timer does show. I try not to look at it all the time because it would make me nervous as it's ticking away. I just practice what I wanted to say, and I just try to get it as close to 3 minutes without, maybe like 2:30 at least, to not worry about the time as much. But yeah, the time is visible.
Oh, good. And I love your idea of practicing over Google Meet or Zoom. It can be uncomfortable. People don't want to do it because we hate looking at ourselves on the computer, and we do it all day long now. But it really helps to be able to practice and play it back. And so I love that you did that and pushed yourself, because a lot of people just kind of stay in their head. And with an AI interview or a in-person interview, it's so important that we practice saying it out loud because it sounds different in our head than it does coming out of our mouth. So like you can write it out perfectly, but there's just it's good to say it out loud and kind of adjust as you go. So thank you for sharing. That's very,
You're
very
welcome.
helpful.
Well,
Any
we
other-
don't have any more questions in the chat. I am keeping an eye on it in case anyone is typing right now. But let's go ahead and wrap up and just say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Catherine. Oh my gosh, this was really wonderful, helpful. There's a lot to consider when refreshing the resume, and we really appreciate the tools.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to work with you all as you kind of move forward with your job search or reinvention. So hopefully I'll get to meet with some folks after this.
I hope so too. There's instructions on our website and on the slide for emailing to get your coaching session started. Look for an email from me directly with everything we covered today, the recording, the tools, things like that. If not by the end of this week, then early next week. And of course, keep reading your emails, check the website for more career events coming up later this year.
Yep.
All right. Thank you again, Catherine, and hope to see you guys at the next one. Bye for now.
Everybody have a great rest of the week.